Before we get into today's episode, we want to remind you that the conversations you're about to hear are built around real-world events, current reporting, and evolving situations that are still unfolding in real time. And while we do our best to stay accurate and grounded, some details may shift as new information comes out. This show is about perspective, analysis, and asking the questions that don't always get asked out loud, not blind agreement. So take what you hear, think critically, and come to your own conclusions. And let's be honest for a second. Just because something isn't being screamed across every headline doesn't mean it isn't happening. Some of the biggest shifts don't come with breaking news banners. They come quietly, piece by piece, until one day everyone feels it at the same time. That's where we are right now, and that's exactly what we're getting into today.
There's a strange feeling right now, and you can't quite put your finger on it, but you know it's there. Nothing looks explosive on the surface, no official declarations, no massive breaking headlines every hour, but somehow everything feels tighter, like the room's getting smaller, like the pressure's building just enough that people are starting to notice it in their daily lives, even if nobody's standing at a podium explaining why. And that's the part that should make you pause, because when things are obvious, they get talked about. But when they're quiet, when they're subtle, when they're layered, that's usually when the real movement is happening underneath. Because let's call it what it is, people aren't reacting to headlines right now. They're reacting to their wallets, their routines, their day-to-day reality. Gas creeps up a little more, groceries don't quite stretch as far, and suddenly that "we're not technically at war" line doesn't really mean much when it feels like you're already paying for one. And nobody's coming out and saying it directly, but you can feel it. This slow, steady squeeze that doesn't hit all at once. It just builds until people start asking, why does everything feel harder than it did a few months ago? And what makes it even more interesting is how controlled the messaging is. You're not seeing panic, you're not seeing urgency, you're seeing calm, measured updates, carefully worded statements like everything is under control, and maybe it is. But that doesn't change the reality that things are shifting, and those shifts don't stay isolated for long. They move through markets, through supply chains, through everyday life, and before you know it, something that started halfway across the world is showing up right at your front door, in your bills, your budget, your stress level. So tonight, we're not chasing headlines. We're talking about the part nobody really spells out, the cost you're already paying, the pressure you're already feeling, and the question nobody seems to want to answer directly. If this isn't a war, then why does it feel like one? All right, let's bring in the crew tonight, because if there's one thing we do well here, it's take that everything's fine narrative and poke it until something honest falls out of it. And trust me, this topic right here, this slow squeeze everybody's feeling but nobody's fully explaining, yeah, this is right in our wheelhouse. Brian's here tonight, already fired up, probably 3 headlines deep and one step away from blaming this entire situation on weak leadership, bad policy, and someone somewhere still thinking solar panels can stop a missile. He's got that "I told you this was coming" energy locked and loaded, and I can already see it in his face. He's not here for calm analysis. He's here to call it exactly how he sees it, whether people like it or not. Rachel's with us, bringing the balance like always. The one who's going to slow things down just enough to separate what's actually happening from what just feels like it's happening. And she's going to be the one asking the uncomfortable question tonight. Are we reacting to real pressure, or are we reacting to the perception of it? And knowing Rachel, she's not letting anybody get away with oversimplifying this. Daniel's here too, and let's be honest, this is his kind of topic. Quiet pressure, controlled messaging, things happening behind the scenes. Yeah, he's already connecting dots nobody else is even looking at yet. By the time he's done, we're either going to have a deeper understanding of what's going on, or we're all going to need a whiteboard and a week to process it. And Skylar's here tonight. And you already know she's coming in from a completely different angle. She's going to challenge the entire premise of this conversation, question whether this pressure narrative is being overstated, and probably remind everyone that global instability doesn't just show up out of nowhere. It's built over time through decisions on all sides. She's not here to agree. She's here to push back. And honestly, that's exactly what this conversation needs. And that's the balance tonight. Heat, logic, pushback, and just enough chaos to keep it honest. So let's get into it. Here's what I want to start with, because this is where things start to feel off. We keep hearing that nothing major has officially changed, right? No full-scale war, no massive declaration, no moment where everything suddenly shifts overnight. But at the same time, you've got increased military positioning, you've got economic pressure building, you've got global movement that doesn't exactly scream, everything's normal. It's like we're being told one thing while feeling something completely different. And I think that's where people are starting to get stuck. Because when reality and messaging don't quite line up, people don't just ignore that. They start asking questions. Maybe not out loud, maybe not all at once, but they feel it. That quiet sense that something is building, something is moving, and it's not being fully explained in a way that matches what they're experiencing in real time. So Brian, let me start with you on this, because I already know where you lean on it. Are we looking at a situation where leadership is intentionally keeping things calm while things escalate behind the scenes? Or is this just the natural ripple effect of global tension that people are reading too much into?
Look, I'm going to say this straight because that's what people are already thinking, but maybe not saying out loud. We are absolutely being slow-walked into something bigger. And the reason it feels off is because the messaging doesn't match the movement. You don't increase military positioning, tighten economic pressure, and start flexing globally unless you're preparing for escalation. Period. That's not conspiracy, that's strategy. And what drives me nuts is this constant attempt to keep everything sounding calm and controlled, while regular people are already feeling the effects. Gas doesn't creep up for no reason. Supply chains don't just magically tighten, and markets don't get shaky because everything's fine. That's not how this works. So when people say, well, we're not technically at war, yeah, maybe not on paper, but in reality, the pieces are moving like we're already in it, just without the headline yet. And here's the part nobody wants to admit. This idea that you can apply pressure overseas without it coming back home is a fantasy. Every decision being made right now has a cost, and that cost doesn't hit policymakers first. It hits everyday Americans. It hits the guy filling up his truck, the family trying to stretch groceries, the small business watching margins disappear. That's the real war tax, whether they want to call it that or not. And I'm not saying pressure isn't necessary. Sometimes it is. But don't sit there and pretend this is contained. Don't act like this is some clean, controlled situation that doesn't affect people here, because it already does. The problem isn't just what's happening, it's that people feel it, but nobody's being straight about why. And when that gap grows between reality and what people are being told, that's when trust starts to break down.
You know what, Brian? That right there is exactly where people are getting caught in this weird middle ground. Because it's not that they're being told something completely false, it's that they're not being told the full picture. And that gap between what's technically true and what's actually happening, that's where the frustration starts to build. Because yeah, on paper, no official war, no massive escalation announcement, everything sounds controlled. But in real life, people don't live on paper. They live in their bank accounts, their gas tanks, their grocery receipts. And when those start shifting, they don't need a press conference to tell them something's different. And I think that's the part that makes this feel heavier than it normally would. Because like you said, pressure doesn't stay contained. It moves. It always moves. It starts in one place, and then it ripples out until everybody feels it in some way, shape, or form. And right now, it feels like we're in that ripple phase, where nothing's exploded yet, but everything's shifting just enough that people are starting to notice it. And when leadership keeps the tone calm while the impact feels anything but calm, that's where people start asking, all right, what's not being said? But Rachel, let me bring you in here, because you're usually the one who pulls this back into focus. Are we looking at a real, measurable escalation that's being softened in how it's communicated? Or is this one of those moments where perception is getting ahead of reality, and people are connecting dots that may not fully be there yet?
I think what makes this moment so complicated, and honestly so easy to misread, is that both of those things can be true at the same time. There is real movement happening, military positioning, economic pressure, shifting alliances, but that doesn't automatically mean we're on the brink of something catastrophic. At the same time, perception isn't just some abstract overreaction either. People build their understanding of the world based on what they experience day to day, and right now what they're experiencing is instability. Prices fluctuating, messaging that feels incomplete, and a general sense that something is changing without being clearly defined. So when you ask whether this is real escalation or perception getting ahead of reality, I'd say it's a feedback loop. Real actions create subtle impacts. Those impacts shape perception, and that perception then amplifies the sense that something bigger is happening. And where I think we need to be careful is not jumping too quickly to conclusions that feel satisfying, but may not be fully supported yet. It's easy to look at rising gas prices or global tension and connect it directly to a single cause. But the truth is, these systems are layered. Energy markets respond to speculation as much as reality. Geopolitical positioning often includes signaling rather than immediate action. And governments, on all sides, manage messaging to avoid panic as much as to inform. That doesn't mean people are wrong to feel pressure, but it does mean we have to separate what we know from what we assume. Because if we blur that line too much, we risk turning uncertainty into certainty. And that's where conversations stop being productive and start becoming reactive.
And that right there is why this conversation matters. Because what you just laid out, Rachel, is that uncomfortable middle ground nobody really likes sitting in. It's a lot easier to say, everything's fine, or everything's falling apart, than it is to admit we're somewhere in between, where real things are happening, real pressure is building, but not in a way that's clean, obvious, or easy to define. And I think that's exactly why people feel uneasy, because uncertainty doesn't come with clear edges. It just kind of hangs there, and people start trying to fill in the blanks themselves. But I'll say this, and this is where I lean a little closer to what Brian was saying. Whether it's perception or reality, the impact is real. That's the part you can't ignore. You can explain markets, you can explain signaling, you can explain layered systems. But at the end of the day, people don't live in explanations. They live in outcomes. And when those outcomes start stacking up, higher costs, tighter margins, more pressure, it stops feeling theoretical pretty quick. So even if some of this is perception amplifying the situation, it's amplifying something that already exists, not something that came out of nowhere. So Daniel, I'm going to hand this to you because this is where you tend to take it a step further. We've got real movement, we've got perception building on top of it, and we've got messaging that's staying calm while everything underneath shifts. What are we not seeing right now? Because it feels like there's another layer to this that hasn't fully come into view yet.
Yeah, there is another layer, and it's not even hidden that well once you stop looking at this like a series of isolated events and start looking at it like a coordinated pattern. Because what we're watching right now isn't just pressure building, it's pressure being managed. That's the key difference. You've got military movement, economic shifts, controlled messaging, and none of it is being allowed to spike too fast. That's not accidental. That's what you do when you're trying to reshape a situation without triggering panic or backlash. You don't slam the system. You tighten it slowly. You normalize each step. And by the time people fully realize what's changed, they've already adjusted to it.
And here's where it gets interesting.
This isn't just about one region or one conflict. This is about positioning across multiple fronts at the same time. Energy markets, supply chains, financial stability, military posture, they're all connected, and they're all being influenced in ways that don't require a single defining moment. No big event, no obvious turning point, just a series of controlled moves that keep everything in motion without tipping it over. And that's why it feels like something's happening, but nobody can quite point to it, because there isn't one moment to point to. It's the accumulation. It's the slow shift of the entire board. So when people say, "Why does this feel off?" It's because it is, but not in the way people expect. It's not chaos, it's not collapse, it's controlled pressure being applied in a way that keeps the system stable on the surface while it's being adjusted underneath. And whether you call that strategy, necessity, or something else entirely, it doesn't change the fact that once those kinds of shifts start, they don't just reverse overnight. They play out.
You know, Daniel, that's the part that makes people lean forward a little bit. Because what you're describing isn't chaos, it's control. And I think for a lot of people, that's actually more unsettling. Chaos you can recognize, you can react to it, you can prepare for it. But controlled pressure? That's different. That's something that builds quietly, adjusts things slowly, and before you even realize it, you're operating in a completely different environment than you were a few months ago. And nobody ever really announced the change. And I think that's where this all comes together, because Brian's looking at the impact and saying, this is real, people are already paying for it. Rachel's saying, we've got to separate what we know from what we feel. And you're saying, there's a structure to this that people aren't fully seeing yet. And when you stack those together, it paints a picture that's not explosive, but it's definitely not nothing either. It's movement, real movement, just happening in a way that doesn't trigger alarm bells until it's already been in motion for a while. But Skylar, let me bring you in here because you're usually the one who challenges the framing of all this. Are we overcomplicating what could just be normal global tension playing out the way it always does? Or is there actually something different about how this is unfolding right now that people should be paying closer attention to?
I think what's happening here is a perfect example of how easy it is to take a real situation and layer meaning onto it until it feels bigger, more coordinated, or more intentional than it actually is. Not everything that feels controlled is part of some structured, deliberate, slow squeeze. Sometimes it's just how global systems operate. Messy, interconnected, and constantly adjusting to pressure points. Energy markets respond to risk, governments posture to avoid looking weak, and messaging stays measured because the last thing anyone wants is panic. That doesn't mean there's some coordinated effort to quietly reshape everything. It means multiple systems are reacting at the same time, and it creates that feeling of tension without a single defining cause. And I think it's important to push back on the idea that people are being kept in the dark in some calculated way. Governments manage tone because markets are sensitive, because escalation can spiral, and because sometimes restraint is the strategy, not secrecy. That doesn't mean people aren't feeling real pressure. They absolutely are. But that pressure doesn't automatically equal hidden intent or a larger plan unfolding behind the scenes. It can just as easily be the natural result of a global system under strain, where no one has full control, and everyone is reacting in real time. So before we frame this as something being orchestrated or withheld, we should at least consider that what we're seeing might just be complexity. Not conspiracy, not coordination, just complexity, playing out in a way that feels unfamiliar because we're living through it instead of looking back on it.
And honestly, Skylar, that's a fair push, and it's needed, because if we don't challenge the framing, then everything starts to sound bigger, darker, and more intentional than it actually is. And I think what you just laid out is the reality check side of this conversation. Sometimes things feel coordinated simply because multiple systems are reacting at the same time. Markets move, governments posture, messaging stays measured, and when all of that happens at once, it creates that sense of pressure without there necessarily being some master plan behind it. That's not crazy. That's how global systems have always worked. But I'll say this, and this is where I think everything we've talked about tonight connects. Whether it's coordination, complexity, or just a series of reactions stacking on top of each other. The end result is the same for the people feeling it. The pressure is real. The cost is real. The shift is real. And I think that's where this conversation lands. Not in trying to prove whether there's some hidden structure or not, but in acknowledging that something is changing, and people are experiencing that change in real time, whether it's being fully explained or not. And maybe that's the takeaway for this first part. It's not about picking one narrative and running with it. It's about recognizing that we're in a moment where things are moving, pressure is building, and clarity hasn't quite caught up yet. And when that gap exists, people are going to fill it with questions, with concerns, and sometimes with assumptions. That doesn't make them wrong. It just means they're trying to make sense of something that hasn't been fully defined yet.
All right, before we wrap things up, let's take a second and talk about something we actually can control. And that's how you represent what you stand for. If you've been riding with us on Data and Dissonance, then you already know this isn't just a podcast. It's a mindset. It's about asking questions, thinking for yourself, and not just accepting whatever gets handed to you without taking a closer look. And that's exactly what our merch represents. From hoodies and hats to mugs, stickers, and of course the coffee blends. Everything we've built is tied to that same idea. Speak truth, stir thought. And if you're feeling that pressure we talked about tonight, if you're seeing things that don't quite add up and you're the kind of person who's not afraid to question it, that's exactly who this brand is for. So check it out, support the show, grab something that fits your style, and be part of what we're building here. All the links are in the description.
You know, what stands out to me after this conversation isn't any one specific detail. It's the pattern. It's that feeling people have right now where nothing seems dramatically different on the surface, but everything feels just a little bit tighter underneath. And I think that's what makes this moment so interesting, because it's not defined by a single event. It's defined by accumulation. Small shifts stacking on top of each other until people start to notice that something isn't quite the same as it was before. And whether you land closer to Brian's perspective, Rachel's, Daniel's, or even Skylar's pushback, I think there's one thing that's hard to argue against. The impact is real. People are feeling it. And when people feel something consistently enough, they start looking for explanations, they start asking questions, and they start paying attention in a way they might not have before. That doesn't mean every conclusion is right, but it does mean the experience itself is valid. And maybe that's where we are right now, not in a moment of clear answers, but in a moment of awareness, where people are starting to connect dots, even if they don't fully know how those dots fit together yet. And that's not a bad thing. Because awareness is what leads to better questions, and better questions are what eventually lead to better understanding. The only real mistake would be ignoring it altogether and pretending nothing's changing when clearly something is. So whatever this turns into, whether it's just a phase of global tension or something more long-term, this is one of those moments where it pays to stay aware, stay grounded, and not just take things at face value. Because the biggest shifts don't always come with warning signs. Sometimes they just show up in your everyday life before anyone fully explains why. Remember to speak truth. Stir thought.
This episode of Data and Dissonance is brought to you by the Caleb Rourke Thriller series and the music that brings that same world to life. Because if tonight's conversation got you thinking about pressure, about what's happening beneath the surface, about the things that don't get fully explained, then that's exactly the space these stories live in. The Caleb Rourke series isn't just action, it's layered. It's about power, control, hidden agendas, and the kind of decisions that shape the world long before anyone ever hears about them. You start with the Covenant Protocol, move into the Prophet Directive, and now Black Echo Rising, where everything starts to collide in ways that feel a little too real. But it doesn't stop on the page, because the music carries that same energy. Whether it's the grit and edge of Uncaged, or the raw, grounded storytelling of Four Wheelers and Hallelujah, these aren't just songs, they're extensions of the same mindset. Real struggles, real perspective, and that same underlying message you hear on this show. See things for what they are, not just what they're presented as. It's all connected. The books, the music, the conversations. It's one universe, built around the idea of questioning more, seeing deeper, and thinking for yourself. So if you want to go beyond the conversation, step into it. Check out the Caleb Rourke thriller series and the music. All the links are in the description.